Interest groups, mobilization, and advocacy. We talked about parties. This is the other side of the coin about how policy is made. We have parties, maybe not great, maybe they are good. Interest groups, maybe not great, maybe they are good. Let's find out. Basically, lobbyists provides not the exact signal, not exactly telling people how they want to vote. They find that they provide information and labor and potentially expertise to the senator or the representative or the president that they're talking to. They don't necessarily tell them you need to vote this way. They persuade them through providing information. Basically, they find, sure, maybe the story is better here. Sure, there are lobbyists that have access to these people and they have a lot of resources and they have a lot of money, but they aren't telling people exactly how to vote. And those senators and those representatives, there's no guarantee that they're going to vote the way that the lobbyist wants them to. What they do is they target people who already kind of agree with them. The NRA is not going to try to lobby, the NRA is the National Rifle Association, is not going to try to lobby some guy who has already said, I hate guns, I never want to own a gun, I never want to see a gun, guns make me barf. They're not going to target that guy. They're going to target the guy who has a picture of him hunting in his campaign materials. They're going to target people they already agree with. People who say climate change is a hoax are not going to be lobbied by Greenpeace. They try to give people who already kind of are open to their ideas the way to get their ideas across the finish line. And again, we're going to get into this a lot more in the lecture itself, but influence operates through unequal access to policy resources. The lobbying system has structural biases, okay? Only organized, well-structured, and well-resourced groups can actually access these people. You're not going to have a lobbying group. If we have, group 4 here in the front, create a lobbying 501c of a sudden of people who refuse to talk, and then they're like, oh, we're going to go out into the world now, and I'm sorry, I'm picking on you guys, and we're going to try to convince everybody to take a vow of silence. They're not going to get very far because I'm sorry, between all of you, you don't have millions of dollars. And if you do, what the fuck are you doing here? Does this make sense? Great. So, interest groups. My notes have disappeared. This is bad. No, they're back. So, this lecture, we're going to introduce how organized interests connect citizens and policymakers within American democracy. Interest groups, I want you to cast aside interest groups and lobbyists, your preconceived notions that they are terrible people. You can recollect those notions at the end of the lecture and start to think about them as just neutral vessels that channel participation, they provide information, and they do influence policy outcomes. Try to understand them from a structural perspective and not an emotional one. So, what are interest groups? Interest groups are lobbyists, and lobbyists are interest groups. They operate somewhat differently, though. Sometimes an interest group doesn't necessarily lobby in the way that you think of lobbyists. Interest groups are structured collectives of individuals or organizations that pursue policy goals. Unlike parties, which kind of operate the same way, they focus on shaping outcomes rather than contesting elections. We have moved away from Mayhew, finally. These are not single-minded seekers of re-election. They actually care about policy outcomes. Yay! Wonderful. In theory, they expand representation by linking citizens to the state, educating the public, and mobilizing participation. However, there are risks here. There is a cost to lobbying, as I've said, and they tend to represent privileged interests. Also, remember what James Madison says in Federalist number 10. He warns against faction. Faction doesn't just mean political parties. It can also mean organized interests in this sense. James Madison would not be a fan of lobbyists, despite, what lobbyists like to think about themselves. Pluralists' theories, and we'll get into pluralism, later reinterpret this as like a good thing. It's the marketplace of ideas. All of these competing minority interests mean that there's no majority here to have an idea about something. It's just everybody coming together and their ideas blend into this big melting pot and, hey, there we go. Modern political science, though, treats interest groups as essential and problematic. They're intermediaries between the public and elected representatives, but they're not necessarily good ones, but we also kind of need them. There are different types of organized interests. Structure-based groups like the National Federation of Independent Businesses or the National League of Cities. They represent firms and industries or professional sectors. Individual-based groups emerge from citizen mobilization around issues such as civil rights and environmental justice. I point towards BLM as an example of that. Greenpeace is an example of that. PETA originally was kind of an example of that. PETA is a weird one. They kind of do their own thing. The key divide between these two is private interest groups seek specific benefits for members, and public interest groups pursue collective goods. Private interest groups will never say, we are just seeking benefits for the wealthy few. They will never say that. That is what they do, but they will never say that. They will also frame themselves as seeking collective good. That's not true. That's just not true. Many potential interests never organize at all. Remember Manker-Olson and the logic of collective action. There are big free rider problems. There are problems of collective action, people getting together and not being able to come to a consensus or organize. So that leaves a lot of people unrepresented in the sphere of interest groups. So who is represented? Well, empirical data, they reveal a striking class bias in the American interest group system. Surprise, surprise, it always comes back to who has the money. Executives and professionals comprise a small share of citizens, but dominate registered organized interests in Washington, D.C. They call it F Street. It's a very small group of wealthy individuals. Blue-collar and low-income workers, then, are drastically underrepresented. Sure, a union can operate as an interest group. Sure, they can effectively lobby, but there are entire swaths of the nation that do not have union representation. We're in one of those right now. South Carolina, not a fan of unions. Even progressive advocacy groups, think about like the Center for American Progress, even those progressive advocacy groups draw membership disproportionately from the upper middle class. Think of like well-meaning NIMBYs and YIMBYs, okay? This pattern challenges this pluralist assumption that there are all these minority interests coming together into this melting pot of the free marketplace of ideas, and that way there's no majority that is dominating the conversation because there's an entire group of people whose ideas are not being heard by this system. So let's get to pluralism here. Let's talk about pluralism. Pluralism was the dominant theory of American government in the mid-20th century. It holds that democracy functions best when all interests can compete freely. It's capitalism plus democracy, and whoever wins out in this idea war is the victor in like a Darwinian sense. David Truman and Robert Dahl, that's the people who come up with this. They view competition as self-regulating. No single group can dominate because others counterbalance it, but this equilibrium assumes this equal ability to organize. It's like absolute capitalists, right? Sure, the market will work in a perfectly free market system, but we don't have that. And therefore, oligarchy reigns. This is an economic fact. Same thing here. Pluralism, in abstract, in a perfect system where everyone can organize equally. This works, but we don't have that. Remember what Schattschneider says. The flaw in pluralist heaven is that the chorus sings with a distinctly upper-class accent. Basically, rich people, represented by the Monopoly man here, again, I have trouble finding images for these slides, is the group that gets heard. Now, there are multiple strategies that interest groups adopt. There are inside strategies. Inside strategies focus on direct engagement with policymakers, rubbing elbows, and the dreaded buzzword that all of us have to deal with, networking. Lobbyists cultivate long-term access to legislators, committees, and bureaucratic agencies. They provide technical information, draft bill language, and shape regulatory rules. Lobbyists will often just write legislation that ends up on the floor of Congress. Many former staffers and even elected representatives operate in this thing called the revolving door, where they go into office, or their staffers in office, and then they get out of that because they lose an election or because they retire, and then they become a lobbyist, and then they just kind of circle around and around and around. Lobbyists also can act through the courts through amicus briefs. Does anybody know what an amicus curiae brief is? It's Latin. All of you, I know you went to Catholic school. Amicus curiae, a friend of the court brief. When the Supreme Court is deciding a case, or they're thinking of taking a case, someone can write an opinion to the court that says, like, hey, you guys should consider this. Interest groups will do that. Brown v. Board of Education started through that. Yes? Oh, notice and comment advocacy. I was going to get to that. So, when regulatory rule changes happen, there is a notice and comment period. Again, I talked about this during the bureaucratic unit of the class. Most of the lawmaking in America happens in the regulatory stage, not actually in a legislature. So, when a bureaucracy is thinking of changing a rule, think about like some code on buildings that require like an EPA permit or something like that. They will open up that rule change for a period of time, notice the public, post a notice, where the public can then comment on that rule change. They can log their complaints, log their ideas in some kind of communal environment. There are a lot of good political science studies that have taken this text data and studied who is speaking. It's all the rich people too, because how many of you knew that when a rule changes, you guys too can write a little comment and be like, no, I want to be able to build a freeway without filling out paperwork. Because all of you are building freeways. No? Okay. This is an old figure, but I think it's cool. Basically, the cost of lobbying, who's spending money. This has changed a lot here. Oracle isn't even on here. Oracle, I still don't know what the hell they do. They spend a lot of money on lobbying. That's Larry Ellison's company. Don't ask me what they do. Nobody knows what they do, including Oracle employees. So there are also outside strategies. Outside strategies, they rely on public mobilization rather than closed-door negotiation. So inside strategies, you're inside the room, rubbing elbows with the members of Congress or with the president or something. Outside strategies, you're getting out into the street and applying pressure that way. Groups engage in campaigns to structure policy debates. Just Stop Oil is a great example of this. Say what you will about them with throwing orange paint on priceless works of art to attract attention about oil usage and climate change, but it does get their name in the headlines and starts some kind of discussion, whether that's about oil and climate change or just about how annoying people who throw orange paint on Van Gogh pieces are. That remains to be seen. This is an approach called going public, and it pressures policymakers by amplifying citizen sentiment. Remember during the Civil Rights Unit when I talked about how protest is a necessary part of a democratic society? This is where that lower class influence can happen. However, talking about foreign money and lobbying, this is potentially where you can get into some trouble. Some grassroots efforts, grassroots as in coming from the people, can be ruined by the appearance of astroturfing. Does anybody know what astroturfing is? Not like the actual process of like creating a synthetic turf field, if you guys are into sports. Astroturfing is this idea, so if grassroots organizations are from the people coming up, astroturf is a fake version of that. Basically, there is outside investment into the organization that means that it is disingenuous. It's a few wealthy people who are funding all of these smaller people to then go out there. Be wary when people criticize a movement of astroturfing. It does happen. It does exist. But for example, let's take the No Kings rallies. People said that those were astroturf. They were funded by people, right, to like go out there and protest. There were 8 million people who protested. How much do you think it costs to fund a protester? $50? I don't go protesting for $50 on the day that I had to work. $100? Compound that by 8 million. it doesn't make logical sense. You need to be operating within the realms of belief, right? Like, Just Stop Oil has had some protests where they have had people be paid to go do what they're doing. Sure, they are aides of the organization, but it is not the same image that they project of everybody just going out there and volunteering to do this thing. Right? We understand astroturfing now? Yes? Cool. Lobbying expenditures really show the magnitude of lobbying influence. So in 2021, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Realtors, and the pharmaceutical and insurance industry topped the spending list of of how much they're spending. This is billions and billions of dollars in lobbying. And this is not like money under the table, like I'm giving you a bribe for how to vote, but it's like, oh, I will throw you a campaign fundraiser and have this luxurious dinner for everyone for your campaign. And it just happens to be sponsored by ExxonMobil. Or it just happens to be sponsored by Eli Lilly. It just happens to be sponsored by Johnson & Johnson. Interest groups target both Congress and executive agencies, and they shape agenda setting largely through drafting legislation. When I worked for the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, we used to always joke around that nobody reads, including your legislators. Nobody reads. Nobody sits down and reads what they're writing except for the lobbyists, because they're the ones who write the damn legislation. That's basically what happens. Your legislation is not written by your representatives. It might be written by an aide, but most likely it was drafted by a lobbyist. Money, more often than any other thing, buys agenda inclusion. Money basically gets their foot in the door to say, hey, you guys should pay attention to my interests. Again, this reflects Hall and Deardorff, right? They're not telling people how to vote. They're just getting their foot in the door and saying, you guys should consider this. Who here has heard of PACs and super PACs? A few people? A PAC is a political action committee. Every elected official on the national stage has one. Donald Trump has one. It's called MAGA Incorporated. Fun little whimsical name for what it is, but MAGA Inc., that's what his is called. Interest groups extend their influence into elections through PACs. PACs raise and distribute funds and candidates to candidates aligned with their policy goals. While super PACs and 501c organizations conduct independent expenditures free from contribution limits. Okay, PACs are one thing, political action committee. That's usually funded through campaign finance laws normally. There's limits on how much money can be spent by an individual donor in that. It's how we imagine funding for a campaign should work, right? Like, nobody is donating $4 billion to a campaign suddenly on that. Nobody actually donates $4 billion, but they spend a couple million, right? Super PACs are external from candidates, and they are 501c organizations, which means they are tax-exempt organizations, okay? They, because they are not run by the candidate, just talk about issues. So, say Donald Trump has his MAGA Inc. PAC, but there is another PAC out there that is not coordinating with his campaign whatsoever, that has billions of dollars in a war chest, or millions of dollars in a war chest, that just happens to be talking about all of the policies that Donald Trump agrees with. That is technically not affiliated with his campaign, because they're talking about issues, not about the candidate. You'll notice at the end of some political ads that you see, like in a sporting event or something, it'll say, this ad is not paid for by any candidate or candidates committee. That's usually the phrase at the end of it. That is produced by a super PAC, and is just, dark money in politics. Makes you feel real good while you're watching the Gamecocks lose for the umpteenth time. This, by the way, is an image. Donald Trump has taken PAC influences to a whole new level. He has dinners at the White House now in the Rose Garden Club. What used to be a rose garden is now a lovely patio with tables. And he had a famous one, Crypto and AI Innovators Dinner. It was pay to play. You pay to into his PAC. You get to come and have what was ostensibly apparently an overdone steak, where you can talk to him and David Sachs. So, great dinner conversation. We've already talked about this a little bit, and by a little bit I mean a lot. There is inequality in this, both along wealth and education when it comes to representation in interest groups. Groups representing executives, corporations, and professionals have stable funding and access, while marginalized or diffuse constituencies struggle to sustain organization outside of unions. This asymmetry distorts democratic responsiveness. The people who are speaking are the people being heard. If you can't organize and can't speak, then your issues are not going to be brought to the stage. And remember, there's opportunity cost with all this stuff involved. A bunch of very poor people are not going to get together and form a lobbying group. Homeless people are not going to form a lobbying group, despite the fact that they have very legitimate concerns and interests with the public laws and governance. Reformers to lobbying seek expanding disclosure rules, basically saying who is visiting with these people, who is talking to them, how much money are they spending. Strengthening membership-based organizations that are more diffuse in the number of members. You don't want to just have like the Koch brothers up there spending millions of dollars on their own and forming their own lobbying agency that basically just parrots their talking points. You want to have an organization with at least 3 people instead of 2. Actually, I don't know how many Koch brothers there are. I think there are 2. There might be more. And fostering participatory advocacy. The challenge is to ensure that pluralism functions more as Madison envisions it, of like individual people with ideas, than as it actually operates with a bunch of like diffuse but also like organized interests that represent rich people. So big takeaways here. Interest groups, they are both pillars and problems. We need them to draft our legislation and also to provide expertise, and sometimes they work to give ideas that are from the public, but also they're problems because like it's a lot of money in politics, and also very rich people who are just having their ideas heard rather than the mass public. They enrich participation and policy expertise while also reproducing inequality. Understanding their role requires moving beyond moral judgments of lobbying groups just being bad because it's lobbyists to more structural critiques. How can we make lobbying groups, if they are here, work better for the American people? You can organize and you can figure this out through understanding who organizes, who participates, and how political influence is exercised. Next lecture, we're going to shift from formal organizations to kind of broader social movements and understanding how personal social networks inform how we talk about politics in our daily lives. It really parrots a lot of what we already talked about in the Intro to Political Behavior and Information Processing lecture, so you might want to go back and review that before we get there.